The officer grabbed him by the collar and shoved him toward the wall before he could say a single word. His coffee hit the floor. The cup didn't break. It just rolled slowly across the polished tiles of the lobby, spinning in a lazy circle while everyone in the building watched and said nothing. His name was Vincent Achebe. He was 41 years old, wore a gray wool coat that had seen better winters, and was carrying a binder under one arm that held 6 years of environmental impact assessments. He had driven 4 hours from Sudbury that morning. He had a 9 a.m. meeting with the Deputy Minister of Natural Resources. He was 3 minutes early. None of that mattered to the officer at the door. "Sir, this entrance is for authorized personnel only." The officer, late 20s, broad shoulders, the kind of posture that comes from wanting to look larger than you are, planted himself between Vincent and the elevator bank. "You need to use the public entrance on Wellington." Vincent said calmly that he had an appointment. He reached into his coat pocket for his identification. The officer stepped forward before the hand was even out of the pocket. "Don't reach for anything. Keep your hands where I can see them." The lobby of the Pearson Building in Ottawa has 20-foot ceilings and marble floors that were installed in 1968. The sound carries. The woman at the reception desk, 50s, reading glasses on a lanyard, looked up and then looked back down at her monitor. The security guard near the east corridor turned his head and found something urgent to study on his clipboard. Two civil servants waiting for the elevator stepped closer together without appearing to move at all. Vincent kept his hands visible. He said again that he had a meeting. Room 412, Deputy Minister Hargreaves' office. If the officer could simply call upstairs, "I'm going to need you to step outside. I have an appointment." "Sir, I have an appointment at 9 o'clock. Vincent's voice hadn't changed. It was still even, still quiet. That was the thing about him. People who knew him said he had the kind of stillness that came not from being unaffected but from having learned, a long time ago, that raising his voice only ever made things worse. "My name is Vincent Achebe. I'm a senior environmental consultant. I was contacted by this office 6 weeks ago. I drove from Sudbury this morning. I would like someone to call upstairs." The officer looked at him the way certain people look at a problem they've already decided how to solve. "I'm going to ask you one more time to step outside, or I'm going to have to escort you out." "On what grounds?" "You're causing a disturbance." There was no disturbance. There was a man standing in a lobby holding a binder, speaking in a measured voice, asking for a phone call. The disturbance, if there was one, was entirely in the officer's imagination, or in something older and less nameable than imagination. Vincent was escorted out. The word escorted does a lot of work in sentences like that. What it means is that the officer took him by the upper arm, walked him to the revolving door, and pushed him through it with enough force that he stumbled on the step outside and had to catch himself against the railing. His binder fell open on the wet pavement. November in Ottawa. The pages scattered. He knelt on the sidewalk and picked them up one by one while people walked past him in both directions. Nobody stopped. A woman in a red coat stepped over one of the pages without breaking stride. He got back to his feet. He straightened his coat. He looked at the glass doors of the building he'd just been thrown out of. Then he called his contact in the ministry on his cell phone and left a voicemail explaining what had happened and that he was outside. He waited. He waited for 40 minutes. He stood on the sidewalk outside the Pearson Building on a Tuesday morning in November with his binder tucked back under his arm, and he waited. Because what else do? You wait. You stay calm. You don't give anyone another reason. Vincent had grown up in Thunder Bay, the second of 3 children. His father had emigrated from Nigeria in the late 70s and worked in the paper mill outside of town for 22 years. His mother was from a small Cree community 2 hours north. He had his father's height and his mother's patience, which was a combination that had served him well and cost him more than he could calculate. He had a master's degree in environmental science from the University of Guelph. He had worked for 3 different consulting firms over 15 years, and, in that time, had produced reports that were cited in federal policy documents, provincial land use frameworks, and, once, a Supreme Court of Canada decision about resource extraction on treaty land. He had never been credited by name in any of those documents. That was standard in the industry. He understood that. What he had not quite managed to understand, though he had been given ample opportunity to practice, was the way certain rooms went quiet when he walked in, the way certain people looked at his face and then at his credentials and then back at his face, as if one of those things was not matching up with the other. The way a lobby officer in a government building could look at a 41-year-old man in a wool coat carrying a professional binder and see, instead, something that needed to be removed. He had a complaint process he could follow. He knew that. He had followed it before. His contact at the ministry, a woman named Sylvie, called him back at 9:20, breathless and apologetic. She had just gotten out of a meeting. She hadn't seen his voicemail until a minute ago. She was coming down. She appeared through the revolving door. 2 minutes later, a woman in her mid-50s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a lanyard that bore the logo of 3 different federal departments. She looked at Vincent, then at the building behind her, then back at Vincent with an expression that was 1 part mortification and 2 parts a kind of exhausted recognition. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I'm so sorry. Come inside." They went inside together. The officer at the door, the same officer, did not move or speak. His face had arranged itself into a studied neutrality. Sylvie did not look at him. They took the elevator to the 4th floor. Vincent's meeting had been scheduled for 1 hour. Because of the delay, they now had 20 minutes, and he gave them his 6 years of environmental impact assessments in 20 minutes, clearly and without rushing. While the deputy minister's assistant took notes and Deputy Minister Hargreave, a quiet man in his 60s with wire-rimmed glasses, listened without interrupting. At the end, Hargreave thanked him and said the work was exceptional. Vincent thanked him and took the elevator back down. In the lobby, the officer was helping an elderly man find the accessible entrance. He didn't look up. The complaint took 3 months to process. This was within normal parameters. Vincent filed it the same evening he got back to Sudbury, sitting at his kitchen table with his coffee going cold beside him. Writing out what had happened in the precise documented language he had learned it was the only kind that moved through official channels without being lost. The officer's name, he eventually learned, was Cody Drennan. He was 27 years old and had been with the contracted security firm for 14 months. In that time, there had been 2 prior complaints filed against him. Both had been reviewed and closed. The first involved a man who had been refused entry to a public federal building. The second involved a woman who said she had been followed through a parking garage. Both complainants were described in the case files, without any particular emphasis, as black. The third complaint, Vincent's, was reviewed by an internal oversight officer within the firm. The finding, delivered in a letter, was that the responding officer had followed proper security protocols and that the interaction did not rise to the level of misconduct. Vincent appealed. The appeal took another 4 months. During those 7 months, he kept working. He drove the 4-lane highway between Sudbury and the Nickel Belt 100 times. He wrote reports about groundwater contamination and boreal forest fragmentation and the long-term effects of open-pit mining on indigenous water sources. He presented those reports to municipal councils and provincial committees and First Nations band councils and industry working groups. He was professional and precise, and occasionally, in the evenings, he sat at his kitchen table with his coffee going cold and thought about a lobby and a revolving door and a page from his binder lying on wet pavement, while a woman in a red coat stepped over it without slowing down. His mother called him every Sunday. She asked how he was eating. He told her he was eating fine. He didn't tell her about the complaint. She had spent enough her life watching her son navigate systems that were not built with him in mind. He didn't want her to spend any more of it on this particular one. The appeal finding arrived on a Wednesday in late June. Vincent read it at his kitchen table, and then he read it again. It was not a complete reversal. The language was careful in the way that institutional language is always careful. Measured, qualified, hedged with the kinds of phrases that leave every door slightly open. But it found, clearly and for the record, that Cody Drennan had acted without reasonable cause, that the escalation from verbal interaction to physical removal had not been justified by anything the complainant had done or said, that the prior complaints, taken together, formed a pattern that the firm had failed to address. Drennan was terminated. The firm was required to undergo equity and de-escalation training for all lobby security staff assigned to federal buildings. A letter was placed in the federal contractor record. Vincent put the letter down on the table. He sat with it for a while. Then he picked up his phone and called his mother, not because it was Sunday, but because it was the kind of moment you call your mother for. She picked up on the second ring. He told her what had happened, all of it, starting from November, from the coffee cup rolling across the marble floor. He had not meant to start from the beginning, but he did, and she let him. And when he was done, she was quiet for a long moment. "You should have told me," she said. "I know. You always think you have to carry everything alone." He didn't answer that because she wasn't wrong. "Are you okay?" she asked. He thought about the lobby. He thought about the pavement and the pages and the 40 minutes on the sidewalk and the 20-minute meeting that should have been an hour. He thought about 2 prior complaints that had been closed. He thought about the word pattern, printed in official font in an appeal document on his kitchen table. "Yeah," he said. "I'm okay." He mostly meant it. What happened after is the part the letter didn't cover. 2 weeks after the appeal finding, Vincent received an email from the deputy minister's office. Not from Sylvie, from Hargreave himself. It was brief. It said that the ministry had been reviewing the November consultation and wanted to revisit the engagement, this time with a proper allocation of time and resources. It said that his work had been circulated internally and had generated significant interest. It said the ministry would like to discuss a longer-term consultancy arrangement if he was willing. He was willing. The contract he signed in September of that year was the largest of his career. It covered a 3-year engagement on Northern Watershed Policy that would eventually inform amendments to the Federal Fisheries Act. His name appeared in the acknowledgments, not buried, not abbreviated. His full name, with his credentials, in the acknowledgment section of a federal policy document. He printed it out and put it on his refrigerator, which he understood was a slightly absurd thing for a 41-year-old man to do, but which felt, nonetheless, exactly right. Cody Drennan found other work. That is not incidental information. It matters, the way a lot of things that happen after the official resolution matters. He was hired 8 months later by a private security firm operating out of Canada. There was no requirement, under any regulation then in force, for his termination record to be disclosed to future employers in the industry. The 2 prior complaints, the man refused entry, the woman followed through the parking garage, remained in a closed file that no one was required to consult. This is the part of the story where the narrative is supposed to resolve cleanly. The bad actor punished, the good man vindicated, the system shown to have worked. But the system worked for Vincent Heb in part because Vincent Heb had a master's degree and 15 years of professional documentation and the language skills to write a precise, detailed complaint and the patience to sustain a 7-month appeal and a federal contract that made his presence in that building, in retrospect, politically inconvenient to ignore. What about the man who doesn't have the contract? The woman who can't take 7 months? The person who files the complaint and then needs to keep paying rent and raising kids and doesn't have the bandwidth to appeal a closed finding? Those complaints stay closed. The pattern continues. 2 prior complaints had been dismissed before Vincent walked into that lobby. 2 people had already been through what he went through, and the response had been a letter that said, reviewed and closed. It took a 3rd complaint, documented, appealed, persistent, to produce the word pattern in an official finding. There were people in that lobby on that November morning. The woman at the reception desk, the civil servants near the elevator, The guard who found something urgent to read on his clipboard. Not one of them said anything. Not one of them stepped forward to say, "I saw this. I can confirm what happened." "Wait, let me help." That's not a criticism of those specific people. It's a description of how these things work. The silence isn't malicious. It's just easier than the alternative, and ease is a powerful force in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. Vincent didn't talk about the lobby much after the appeal was resolved. He was, by temperament, a person who preferred to look forward. He had work to do. He had watersheds to protect and reports to write, and a federal contract to earn out over 3 years. But sometimes driving back from a consultation in some municipal building, in some mid-sized Ontario city, he would think about the coffee cup rolling across the marble floor, the way it had spun in a lazy circle while 20 people looked at their shoes. He thought about that more than he thought about the appeal finding, more than the acknowledgments page, more than the contract, a cup spinning on a floor, and a room full of people who decided in that moment that it had nothing to do with them. Ask yourself honestly, if you had been standing in that lobby, what would you have done?